Ever get stuck on a question that seems simple at first, but then, like, the more you think about it, the weirder it gets?
Oh, yeah, totally. Happens to me all the time.
I was thinking about what is there? Like, what actually exists?
So that's a big one. Definitely keeps philosophers busy.
And to even start tackling a question like that,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of need the right tools, right? You need the right concepts. And that's where quantifiers come in. They're these little words, these tiny things that end up having a huge impact on how we even think about existence and logic. So that's what we're diving into today. Quantifiers.
Awesome. It's a dick rabbit hole for sure.
We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on this. So many great points in there.
Yeah, it's a great resource for this.
And don't worry, this isn't going to be like reading a textbook. We'll try to stick to the most interesting and mind-bending parts.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so first things first. Can you give us a quick overview of what quantification is all about in philosophy? Why do philosophers care so much about these little words?
Well, in philosophy, like when you're trying to be really precise about your arguments, you need to be able to talk about how widely things apply. Like, do they apply to just one thing or to some things or to all things? Quantifiers help us do that.
Right, okay, so it's about generality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when you say all cats are mammals, you're using the quantifier all to make a general statement about cats.
Yeah, okay, I see. So that's pretty basic. But I'm guessing it gets more complicated than that.
It totally does. I mean, think about it. There are so many different ways to express generality. You
Yeah.
can say all, you can say some, you can say most, you can even say few. And each of these quantifiers has a different meaning and creates a different logical structure for the statement you're making.
Right, okay, so all cats are mammals is different from most cats are furry.
Exactly. And philosophers and logicians, they've spent centuries trying to formalize these different kinds of quantifiers and figure out how they work together in logical systems.
So how do they go about doing that? Like, where do we even begin with formalizing something like all or some?
Well, some of the earliest attempts go all the way back to Aristotle. Remember those syllogisms? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Ah, yes, classic logic.
Right. And those syllogisms rely on what we call binary quantifiers. They're called binary because they operate on two categories or concepts. All A's are B's, some A's are B's, no A's or B's. These are all examples of binary quantifiers.
I see. So they're relating two groups of things directly.
Exactly. But modern logic actually took a bit of a different approach, starting with thinkers like Boole and Frege. They focused more on what we call unary quantifiers, which operate on single concepts.
Okay, so what are some examples of unary quantifiers?
The big ones are everything, symbolized as for all x, and something or there exists, symbolized as exists x.
Right, so instead of directly relating A's and B's, we're talking about things that exist and whether they have a certain property.
Exactly. And Frege and Russell, they came up with a way to actually translate those binary quantifier statements into statements using these unary quantifiers and logical connectives. So every A is a B becomes for all x or all B. For every x, if x is an A, then x is a B.
Okay, yeah. And some A is a B becomes...
Is this x wedge bx? There exists an x such that x is an A and x is a B.
Got it. So it's like a different way of expressing the same basic idea.
Yeah. But this new way, this using unary quantifiers and connectives, it gave logicians a more fine-grained, more precise way to analyze logical statements.
But I bet it wasn't a perfect solution, was it? There's got to be a catch somewhere.
There's always a catch. This method, it works great for all and some, but it starts to get tricky when you try to apply it to quantifiers like many, most, or few. Like most philosophers or logicians doesn't quite translate neatly into a statement using just for all, and there exists.
Huh, yeah, you're right. It's like most is its own thing, a different kind of beast.
Yeah, and philosophers recognize that. And that's actually what led to the development of something called the theory of generalized quantifiers, which treats those more complex quantifiers like most as fundamental, not something you try to break down into simpler parts.
And that makes sense. So we've got this classical quantificational logic, this system that Frege really helped solidify. What are like the key ingredients of this system from a philosopher's point of view?
Well, at its heart, it's all about having a formal language to work with. A language that lets you express these quantified statements clearly and unambiguously. And then you need a set of rules, a system of axioms and inference rules that tells you how to manipulate those statements and draw valid conclusions.
Okay, so it's kind of like math, right? You have your symbols and your rules for how to use those symbols.
Exactly. And in this formal language, you have your logical connectives, things like not, and, or if, then, if and only if. You have your predicates, which represent properties and relations, and you have your variables, those handy little X's and Y's that let you talk about things without having to name them specifically.
Right. And then, of course, you've got your quantifiers, the for all and this.
Precisely. And a key part of this classical quantificational logic is what we call pure quantificational logic. This is where things get really interesting, philosophically speaking.
Pure quantificational logic. What's so pure about it?
It's pure in the sense that it's stripped down to the bare essentials. It focuses solely on variables and quantifiers without bringing in singular terms like names or constants that refer to specific individuals.
I see. So it's like looking at the skeleton of the system, the basic structure of generality, without getting bogged down in the specifics of any particular things.
You got it. It's about studying the pure logic of all and some, the underlying machinery of how those concepts work together.
Okay, I like it. Back to basics. So how does this pure quantificational logic actually work? Like, what are the rules of the game?
Well, first you have your atomic formulas. These are just predicates followed by the appropriate number of variables. Like, if P stands for is a philosopher and X is a variable, then PX would be an atomic formula, meaning X is a philosopher.
Okay, simple enough.
Then you can start building more complex formulas using those connectives, PX and QY, if PX then QY, and so on. And of course, you can use the quantifiers to bind those variables and express generality. For all X, everything is a philosopher.
Got it. But you mentioned something about free and bound variables earlier. What was that about?
Ah, yes, that's an important distinction. A variable is free in a formula if it's not within the scope of a quantifier that binds it. Like in the formula Px, the X is free. But in for all X, Px, the X is bound by for all quantifier. A formula with no free variables is called a sentence. It expresses a complete proposition, a statement that can be true or false.
Right. So Px by itself isn't a complete statement because we don't know what X refers to. But for all X, Px is a complete statement. It claims that everything is a philosopher.
Exactly. Now, to actually do logic, to draw inferences and prove things, you need a set of axioms and rules. These are the starting points and allowed moves in our logical game. The most basic rule is modus ponens. If you have a statement A and you have if A then B, then you can infer B.
Right. That's like the classic, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. It's raining, therefore the ground is wet.
Exactly. And then you have specific axioms for the quantifiers. One is universal instantiation. If everything has a certain property, then any specific thing you pick also have that property.
Okay, that seems intuitive enough.
But there's a catch, of course. The thing you pick has to be free for the variable in the formula. We have to make sure we don't accidentally substitute a variable into a place where it gets captured by another quantifier, which could change the meaning of the statement.
Right, so we can't just go willy-nilly substituting things in.
Yeah.
Got to be careful with those variables. What other axioms are there?
There's one that lets you move a universal quantifier around within an implication, but only under certain conditions. And then there's the rule of universal generalization. If you can prove a formula A and the variable X wasn't free in any of the assumptions you used to prove it, then you would infer for all X, A.
So if I can show that something holds true for an arbitrary X without making any special assumptions about that X, then I can conclude that it holds true for all X.
Precisely. That's the essence of universal generalization. And from these basic axioms and rules, you can derive a ton of other logical principles, like existential generalization. If you know that some specific thing has a property, then you can infer that there exists something that has that property.
Makes sense. But the entry mentions that in this system, you can actually derive the statement, if everything is P, then something is P. For all xpx, right arrow exists xpx. And some philosophers aren't too happy about that.
Yeah, that's a point of contention. It basically means that logic itself seems to guarantee the existence of at least one thing. Some philosophers think logic should be ontologically neutral, not taking a stance on whether things actually exist or not.
I see. So it's about the relationship between logic and existence, about whether logic itself has existential implications. Deep stuff. But so far, we've just been talking about the symbols and rules. How do we actually give meaning to these formulas, determine whether they're true or false?
Right, because symbols on their own don't really mean anything. We need a way to connect them to something meaningful. That's where model theory comes in.
Model theory.
It's a way of giving a formal interpretation to our language, a way of connecting the symbols to something we can think about. A model essentially creates a little world, a specific scenario where our language can be interpreted. It has a domain, which is the set of all the things our variables can refer to, and it has an interpretation function that gives meaning to our predicates, tells us which objects in the domain have the properties represented by those predicates.
So if our predicate is P for is a philosopher, the interpretation function tells us which things in our model's domain are actually philosophers.
Precisely. And then, using this model, we can define what it means for a formula to be true. A formula is true in a model if it's satisfied by all possible variable assignments within that model.
A variable assignment.
It's just a way of assigning specific objects from the domain to each variable in our language. Like, if our domain is the set of all people, a variable assignment might assign Socrates to the variable x and Plato to the variable y.
Got it. So we're like plugging in actual things for the variables and seeing if the statement holds true.
Exactly. And if a formula is true in all possible models, then we say it's logically valid. It's like saying the statement is true no matter what the world looks like, no matter what things exist.
That's cool. So we have this connection between our formal system, our proofs, and our models, our interpretations.
And what's amazing is that for pure quantificational logic, our proof system and our model theory are perfectly aligned. If a formula can be proven from our axioms, it's also logically valid. And if it's logically valid, then it can be proven. This is known as the completeness theorem, and it's a pretty big deal.
Wow. So our symbols and rules in our little model worlds, they're telling us the same things about what's logically true.
Yep, at least in the realm of pure quantificational logic. And there are other cool results too, like compactness, which has to do with the relationship between infinite and finite sets of formulas.
Okay, so this pure quantificational logic, it's like a clean, elegant framework for studying generality. But to actually talk about the world as we know it, we need more than just variables and predicates.
We need names. We need to be able to talk about specific things, about Socrates, about the planet Jupiter, about that weird painting in your living room.
Exactly. We need singular terms. And importantly, we need the concept of identity, a way to say that two things are actually one and the same.
And that's where we move from pure quantificational logic to what we call classical quantificational logic with identity. We expand our language to include individual constants, which are symbols that stand for specific objects. Like, we could have a constant S for Socrates.
Okay, so now I can write P.S. Socrates is a philosopher.
Exactly. And we add function symbols, which let us build more complex terms, like father of S could represent Socrates' father. And of course, we add the identity predicate, usually symbolized as, now we can write things like S is P, meaning Socrates is identical to Plato.
Hold on. I thought we were trying to talk about the world as we know it, not some crazy world where Socrates and Plato were the same person.
Right. That was just an example. But the point is, we now have the power to express identity claims, to say that two different ways of referring to something actually point to the same thing.
Like saying Hesperus is phosphorus. Two different names for the same planet, Venus.
Exactly. Our atomic formulas now include not only predicates applied to terms, but also these identity statements between terms.
So how do the axioms change when we add identity?
Well, the axioms for quantification are adjusted slightly to accommodate these new terms, and we add two new axioms specifically for identity. The first is reflexivity. Everything is identical to itself, XX.
That's pretty obvious.
It is, but it's a crucial starting point. The second axiom is the indiscernibility of identicals, sometimes called Leibniz's law. If two things are identical, they have all the same properties.
Yes. Leibniz's law, one of the cornerstones of metaphysics. If A be B, then whatever is true of A is also true of B.
Precisely. And with these axioms, we can then prove all sorts of other properties of identity, like symmetry and transitivity.
Symmetry being if A, B, then B, A. And transitivity being if A, D, and B, C, then A key. A.
Exactly. And the model theory gets extended too. Now, our interpretation function has to assign an actual object in the domain to each individual constant. And the identity predicate is true in a model if and only if the two terms on either side of it actually refer to the same object in that model's domain.
So our model worlds are getting more intricate now, more fleshed out.
They are. But the amazing thing is that all those nice metatheoretic properties we talked about before, soundness, completeness, compactness, Lowenheim-Skolem, they all still hold for classical quantificational logic with identity.
Wow. So this system, it's powerful and it's robust.
Yeah.
No wonder it's used so much in modern logic and philosophy.
Yeah. It's kind of the gold standard. But But of course, not everyone is happy with it. There are philosophers and logicians who have raised some serious challenges to classical logic, exploring alternative systems that depart from its core assumptions.
The logical rebels. I'm always up for a good rebellion. So what kind of challenges are we talking about? What are these rebels questioning?
One big challenge is the assumption that the domain of quantification always has to be non-empty. Like, classical logic assumes there's always at least something out there, even if it's just one lonely object.
But what if there's actually nothing? Like, what if the universe is just a big, empty void?
Exactly. And that's where inclusive logic comes in. Inclusive logic allows for the possibility of an empty domain, a universe with absolutely nothing in it.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
Right.
Like, seriously mind-blowing. So what's the motivation for exploring a logic like that?
Well, one motivation is that it seems kind of strange that in classical logic you can derive existential claims from purely logical principles. Remember that statement we talked about earlier? If everything is P, then something is P.
Yeah.
For all XPX, right arrow exists XPX.
Right. Well, if the domain is empty, then that statement should be false. If there's nothing at all, then it can't be true that there's something that's P. But in classical logic, that statement is a theorem. It's always true, even if the domain is empty.
I see. So inclusive logic is about trying to keep logic from sneaking in any sneaky existential assumptions.
Exactly. It's about making sure that logic doesn't force us to believe that things exist when maybe they don't.
Yeah.
And then there's free logic.
Free logic, what makes it so free?
Free logic is all about getting rid of the assumption that every name or definite description in our language actually has to refer to something in the domain.
So, like, I can talk about Sherlock Holmes or unicorns even though they don't actually exist? Exactly. In classical logic, if you use a name, you're pretty much saying that the thing it refers to exists. But free logic lets you use names even for things that don't exist, things that are just made up or fictional.
So in free logic, I wouldn't be committed to the existence of unicorns just because I'm talking about them.
Nope. And this is where things get even more interesting on the model theory side, because now you have to decide how to interpret those empty names, those names that don't actually refer to anything in the domain.
Right, because if a name doesn't point to anything, then what does a sentence containing that name even mean?
That's the million-dollar question. There are different approaches. You have negative free logic, which says that any atomic formula containing an empty name is false. Positive free logic is a bit more lenient. It allows some of those formulas to be true, like maybe Sherlock Holmes, even though there's no Sherlock Holmes in the domain. And then there's neutral free logic, which just says those formulas don't have a truth value at all.
So it's like a spectrum of how to deal with those empty names.
Precisely. And each of these approaches has its own philosophical implications, its own way of carving up the relationship between language and the world.
It's fascinating how all these subtle shifts in the logic can have such big implications. Now, what about intuitionistic logic? That one always felt a bit mysterious to me.
Intuitionistic logic is a whole other ballgame. It's not just about tweaking a few assumptions here and there. It's about a fundamentally different way of thinking about truth and logic.
Okay, so what's the big idea behind intuitionistic logic? What makes it so different?
At its core, it's based on the idea that the meaning of a logical statement is tied to what it takes to prove that statement. It's not enough to just say that something is either true or false. You have to be able to actually demonstrate it, to construct a proof.
I see. So it's like a more constructivist, proof-oriented approach to logic.
Exactly. And this has some pretty big consequences for how we understand quantifiers. For an intuitionist, proving an existential statement like there exists an X such that A means actually finding a specific object that satisfies A and showing that it does.
So you can't just say there exists without actually having a concrete example in hand.
Right. And to prove a universal statement like for all X, A, you need a general method or construction that, when applied to any object, will show that A holds for that object. So it's a much more hands-on, concrete approach to quantifiers.
And I'm guessing this means that some of those classical equivalences between quantifiers don't hold up anymore.
You're absolutely right. The classic equivalence between there exists an X such that A, and it's not the case that for all X, not A, doesn't hold in intuitionistic logic. They become distinct concepts with their own separate proof conditions.
Okay, so intuitionistic logic is definitely shaking things up a bit. But how does model theory work in this context? We were talking about those little model worlds earlier. Can we still use those?
We can, but they get a bit more sophisticated. Intuitionists often use something called Kripke models. They involve these possible worlds or stages of knowledge and an accessibility relation that tells you how you can move between those stages. The domain of quantification can actually expand as you move to later stages, reflecting the idea that your knowledge might grow over time. You might discover new objects or constructions.
So it's like our little model worlds are evolving, becoming more complete as we learn more.
That's a good way to think about it. And these Kripke models can be used to show that some statements that are valid in classical logic aren't valid from an intuitionistic point of view.
Okay, so intuitionistic logic is definitely a different beast. A fascinating beast, but a different one. Now, the entry also talks about substitutional quantification. This seems like a completely different way of thinking about quantification altogether.
It is. Unlike the objectual quantification we've been discussing, where the quantifiers range over objects in the domain, substitutional quantification interprets quantifiers in terms of linguistic expressions, like names.
So instead of ranging over things in the world, the quantifiers range over words.
Exactly. So a statement like, for some name A is true if there's at least one name in our language that we can substitute for A in the formula A to make a true sentence.
So it's like we're playing a game of substitution, plugging in different names and seeing what happens.
Yep. And a statement like, for all names A is true if every possible name we can substitute for A results in a true sentence.
Interesting. But what happens if our language doesn't have a name for everything in the domain? Like there are infinitely many real numbers, but we can only have finitely many names for them.
That's a major challenge for substitutional quantification.
Huh?
In those cases, an objectual quantification might be true because there's an object in the domain that satisfies the condition, but there might not be a corresponding name in our language to make a substitution.
So it's like substitutional quantification gets limited by the expressive power of our language.
Exactly. And this leads to a lot of debate about whether substitutional quantification can really capture everything we want to say about quantification. And there's also a debate about whether it's really that different from objectual quantification, whether it's just a sneaky way of quantifying over linguistic entities instead of things in the world.
It's like the meta questions never end in philosophy.
Yeah.
Always another layer to peel back.
Exactly. And the philosopher Saul Kripke, who did a lot of important work on naming and reference, he actually provided a formal treatment of substitutional quantification, showing how it could be incorporated into a logical system.
So we've explored all these interesting departures from classical logic. Now the entry moves on to talk about extensions of classical logic, ways to make it even more powerful by introducing new types of quantifiers.
Right. So we've got generalized quantifiers, many-sorted quantifications, second-order quantification, plural quantification, and propositional quantification. It's like a whole buffet of quantifiers.
A quantifier feast. Tell me more about these generalized quantifiers. We already talked about most being one of them.
Yeah, so remember how Frege thought of all and some as predicates that apply to concepts? Well, the theory of generalized quantifiers takes that idea and runs with it. It says, hey, we can have all sorts of quantifiers, not just all and some. We can have quantifiers that talk about the number of things, like at least 5 or exactly 10.
So we can formally express things like there are at least 5 cats in this room.
Exactly. And some of these cardinality quantifiers can be defined using the standard for all and there exists. But some of them, especially those that deal with infinite numbers, they actually increase the expressive power of the logic.
Like saying there are infinitely many prime numbers.
Precisely. And adding these powerful quantifiers can have some interesting effects on the logical system. For example, it can make the compactness theorem, which is a key property of first-order logic, no longer hold.
So compactness goes out the window when you start dealing with really big infinities.
Yeah, things get a bit wilder. And there are other cool generalized quantifiers too, like the Chan quantifier and the Rescher quantifier, which are defined in terms of how sets overlap and intersect.
And then there are the generalized binary quantifiers, right? These are the ones that seem to capture more naturally how we use quantifiers in everyday language.
Exactly. Things like all A's are B's, more A's than B's, most A's are B's. They're all about comparing two sets of things and describing the relationship between them.
But the really neat thing is that even Russellian definite descriptions, those phrases like the cat who sat on the mat, can be analyzed using these generalized binary quantifiers.
It's all about finding the right way to formally represent the relationships between things.
Now, what about many-sorted quantification? That sounds like a way to deal with different types of things in our logic.
It is. Imagine you're trying to talk about both numbers and sets of numbers. In standard first-order logic, you'd have to lump them all together in one big domain. But In many sorted logic, you can have different sorts, different categories, each with its own variables. So you might have variables that range over just numbers and other variables that range over just sets of numbers.
So it's like having specialized variables for different kinds of things.
Exactly. And you can even have predicates that only apply to certain combinations of sorts. Like you might have a predicate for is a member of that only makes sense when you're talking about a number and a set of numbers.
Okay, so it's like a more organized, more structured way of doing logic when you have different kinds of things to talk about.
Yep. And while it's not strictly more powerful than standard first-order logic, it can be really useful for certain applications, like when you're dealing with different levels of abstraction or different domains of discourse.
Makes sense. Now, second-order quantifiers, those seem like they really ramp up the power of our logic.
Oh yeah, second-order logic is where things get really interesting. This is where we can start quantifying over not just objects, but over predicates themselves, over properties and relations.
Whoa. So like I can say, there exists a property such that.
Exactly. You can have variables that stand for predicates, and you can use the universal and existential quantifiers to range over those predicate variables. It's like a whole new level of abstraction.
So for instance, I can say, there exists a property that is shared by all philosophers.
Exactly. And that property might be something like love's wisdom.
Right. Or I can say, for all properties, if Socrates has that property, then Plato has it too.
Precisely. And this power, this ability to quantify over predicates, it lets you express things you just can't say in first-order logic. You can define concepts like ancestral relations, like being an ancestor of, and you can even give a categorical axiomatization of the natural numbers, meaning you can describe them in a way that uniquely captures their structure.
But this power comes at a price, doesn't it? Doesn't it mess with some of those nice metatheoretic properties we talked about earlier?
You're sharp. It does. With second-order logic, we lose completeness, compactness, and the Lowenheim-Skolem theorem, at least if we use the standard model theory, where predicate variables range over all possible sets.
So it's like a trade-off. More expressive power, but less well-behaved metatheory.
Exactly. But there's a way to kind of regain some of those metatheoretic properties by using something called Henkin models, where you restrict the range of the predicate variables. It's a bit of a compromise, but it lets you have some of the cake and eat it too.
Now, what about plural quantification? How is that different from second-order logic?
Plural quantification is a bit tricky. It's related to second-order logic, but it focuses on the idea of talking about some things without necessarily having to form a set out of those things. It's like a more direct way of handling plurals in logic.
So instead of saying there exists a set of things such that, I can just say there are some things such that.
Exactly. And this lets you avoid some of the philosophical baggage that comes with sets, especially when you start talking about really big collections of things.
Right, like those potential paradoxes with sets that contain everything.
Yep. Plural quantification is a way of navigating those tricky waters, and it's often seen as being more in line with how we naturally use plurals in language.
And lastly, propositional quantification. That sounds kind of wild, quantifying over sentences or propositions themselves.
It is a bit mind-bending. In standard logic, we have those zero-place predicates, which are basically just propositional variables. They stand for sentences that can be either true or false. And propositional quantification lets you use quantifiers to range over those propositional variables.
So instead of saying there exists an object such that, I can say there exists a proposition such that.
Exactly. And this has some pretty cool applications, like in deflationary theories of truth and in analyzing those tricky self-referential paradoxes like the liar paradox.
So it's like quantifiers are popping up everywhere. They're not just about objects anymore. They're about properties. They're about plurals. They're even about propositions themselves.
That's right. And this all leads to some pretty deep questions about the nature of quantification, about what it really means to say for all or there exists.
It's like quantifiers have become this lens through which we can explore the very foundations of logic and language.
Exactly. And they have huge implications for ontology, the study of what exists. Remember Quine's famous slogan, to be is to be the value of a variable.
Right, that whole idea that what exists is what we can quantify over in our best theories of the world.
Exactly. And the different kinds of quantification we've talked about, they lead to different views on what exists. If you're a fan of second-order logic, you might be committed to the existence of properties and relations as abstract objects. If you prefer plural quantification, you might be more comfortable talking about collections of things without reifying them into sets.
It's like the choice of quantifiers.